Palestine, free, free 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 Palestine. Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog, here today exclusively on Mint Press News. As you know, we are going against the grain and watching the watchers, investigating the structures of power within society. Today, we have a very special episode with my co-host, Mnar Adley, head of Mint Press News. How are you, Mnar?
Hello, I'm doing amazing. Thank you.
And we have two special guests also today who we will get into more with them in a second. But it's important to remember that everything that Mint Press does requires the support of our viewers and our readers. So I would ask that if you were able to, please do support us on Patreon or any other platform that you find on the internet to support and fund Mint Press's news. As you can imagine, publishing articles which investigate powerful people is not always a very easy road to travel in the journalism game. So for that reason, we really do require all the support we can get. So please do help us in that regard. So now we are at a very interesting point in history of our two respective political units, which we are part of. Mnar is, of course, visiting from the United States to check in on the operations of Mint Press in this country. And so we'll have an interesting perspective on the upcoming election, where we have seen Obama and his other partners really in the Democratic Party do everything they can to push Kamala Harris actually ahead of his former colleague Joe Biden in what some are calling a coup from within the Democratic establishment. Now, Mnar, you have just arrived in the country, but when you were in the US, what was your feeling about this sort of frenzy for Kamala Harris that's being pushed by the Democratic establishment?
Well, first, I just want to say how happy I am to be back in London. It's good to be here in the studio with you, Lowkey. We have been watching from the United States, looking to England and the protest movement here, and the actions of Palestine Action to disrupt the Israeli weapons manufacturers as inspiration for, a global movement for change against the U.S.-backed Israeli genocide in Gaza. And so just to answer your question, it's been quite nauseating, to be honest with you, to be watching this election cycle once again. Every 4 years, we're told this is the most important election cycle. And yet we're presented with the same people that represent two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, which are both pro-war, pro-military, corporate Zionist parties. We're basically being told, choose between which killing machine would you prefer, Lockheed Martin or Raytheon? Which one would you like better? Those are the choices that were given in this election season between presidential candidate Donald Trump, who represents the Republicans, and Kamala Harris, who is being pushed now and reintroduced to the public as this, hope and change figure, being compared to Obama by the Democrats. And so, it's just like the same cycle over and over again. Which evil do you want to choose? And we have to remind people that voting for the lesser evil is still evil. And it's been quite disappointing to see, since I was politically involved, since I'm 18 years old, watching third-party candidates, like, candidates from the PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation, or maybe the Green Party, or even the Libertarian Party. Candidates that are independent, that aren't taking corporate funds, being pushed to the sideline. And we're seeing that very heavily right now with people like Jill Stein, who is somebody who I consider a friend. She's the Green Party presidential candidate, and she's very much anti-war, pro environment. And she has been one of the most vocal presidential candidates against Israel's war in Gaza, and she's being pushed to the sideline. She has to go through all these hoops and bounds just to get on ballots across so many different states. And she's also being censored by big tech and censored from the political stage for debates. And I just want to say one of the most upsetting things about this election season, of course, is the way in which Kamala Harris is being reintroduced, in the same way that Obama was brought, to the forefront. I have a picture here, a cover from Time magazine of Kamala Harris. Of course, Time magazine is a propaganda magazine that's constantly promoting militarism and war. And a lot of times, Time magazine promotes neoliberalism as well. And so she's on the cover here in the same way that Obama was on the cover of every single magazine and news outlet in the United States in his famous image and portrayal by artist Shepard Fairey, Hope and Change. And that's what they're doing with Kamala Harris. The Democratic Party is so out of touch with their voter base. We are at the end of the Democratic National Convention in the United States, and the Democrats didn't even allow anyone to speak about Palestine. And Kamala Harris has been kind of portrayed as somebody who doesn't really hasn't had much power as vice president, and she really couldn't have done anything. But she could have, and Joe Biden could have, picked up the phone and ended this war in Gaza at any moment. They could have told the Pentagon to not send any more weapons to Israel. Instead, the Biden administration, with Kamala Harris as the vice president, continued to sell billions of dollars worth of weapons to Israel for Israel to use to drop bombs on Gaza to decimate and massacre children and families. And so the number one issue right now for the Democratic voter base is the genocide in Gaza. And yet, when you pick up a magazine from, this Time magazine cover and you open it up to the article about Kamala Harris, and you see her with Tim Walz, who's the governor of Minnesota, the state that I am from, the article portrays her as an Obama. And the number one issue that she's going to be advocating for is IVF and women's issues and women's right to abortion and healthcare. No mention, of course, how Israel has bombed every single women's IVF clinic in Gaza. 181 women give birth every single day in Gaza without any painkillers. And of course, the war in Gaza has affected mostly women and children. But that's the Democratic Party. That's what they represent. They're always portrayed representing and pushing for human rights, democracy, free speech, all of these things that sound really good, but these are just wolves in sheep's clothing. And so the Democratic Party today, whether Joe Biden is the head of it or Kamala Harris, they're completely out of touch with their voter base who see the genocide in Gaza as the number one issue. We saw that when the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago. Chicago is home to the largest Palestinian community outside of Palestine. I mean, we go there to get Palestinian knafa that's just as good as the knafa in Nablus in the West Bank. And so it was just adding insult to injury, over 200 for holding the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And just to end on this point, over 250 coalition organizations organized the anti-genocide protests outside of the Democratic National Convention, and the city of Chicago denied them a permit to conduct those protests. And they deployed thousands upon thousands of armed police officers to suppress those protests. And they wouldn't allow them within, I believe, 1 mile of the DNC. And when Kamala Harris stood up to speak, she mentioned Gaza and the humanitarian crisis, but she prefaced it that Israel has a right to defend itself. And she mentioned October 7th, the horrors of October 7th, without, of course, putting any blame on Israel using the Hannibal Directive that most likely killed so many of their own citizens. We know that. And of course, we still don't have a shred of evidence of any of that sexual violence that Hamas supposedly committed on October 7th. So this is the Democratic Party. They're going to continue arming Israel. They're going to continue pushing for war and neoliberal policies. We don't need to talk about Donald Trump that much because he already served 4 years as president. We know what his policies are going to be. We saw what that looked like. So it's going to be bad with Donald Trump, and it's probably going to be even worse with Democrats. And why do I say that? It's because they're really good at manipulating the public and abusing their voter base, using minorities to their advantage to push for these pro-war policies. And these unconfirmed voters that have pushed for this unconfirmed vote movement as, as a protest against the Biden administration and the Democrats because of their pro-Israel policies, I think that in the end, they may be manipulated to vote Democrat because we don't want a fascist Trump presidency. Well, both parties are fascist. And so that's what we're seeing now in the United States with this election season. It's like deja vu all over again. Yes, now we have the genocide in Gaza. And I don't think really there's a way to stop it with our current political system. Too much money, too much corruption, too much addiction to war.
Wow. Thank you very much, Mnar. Great to have a US perspective, and certainly somebody from the constituency of Tim Walz as well is an interesting insight there. In a way, I guess we're talking about the what Tariq Ali called the extreme center, who in many ways are right-wingers, really. But Chris Williamson, who is to my left, and Ammar Kazmi, who was intimately involved in Chris's experience within the Labour Party and under Jeremy Corbyn at the time. What you bumped up against, Chris, was really the way in which they are able to assert parameters around political possibility. So while your career in the Labour Party goes back to the Blair years, when I first became aware of you, it was through Defense of Venezuela. It was through a great video talking about some of the intricacies around deregulation that led to the Grenfell Tower. You were, of course, the Grenfell Tower fire. You were, of course, the shadow fire minister at the time. And so these were ideas that were very much out of sync with the mainstream Labour Parliamentary Party. Because while, yes, you had an anti-neoliberal leadership, an anti-war foreign policy in the leadership, what you had by and large across the Labour Party was opportunist careerists who had attached themselves to some of the ugliest parts of US foreign policy. Of course, you had the US, the British US project, the British-American project, which was established really to kind of steer people in particular pro-US directions, that has had a very heavy sway on the Labour Party for many decades. I remember when Blair was first elected, he had something like 5 members of the British-American project in his cabinet. British-American project, obviously funded by the US Embassy, funded by BAE Systems. So, Chris, really, if you could first break down for us your involvement in the Labour Party, how it began, how it started, and then I want to get on to how it came to an unceremonious end.
Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. Yeah, my involvement with the Labour Party goes back to 1976. I joined it as a 19-year-old apprentice bricklayer. I always had kind of this romantic view of the Labour Party, that it was always a force for good, that it was the best vehicle to deliver progressive change in the country. And I look back at some of the advances that have been made for the working class in Britain, and it has been delivered by Labour governments. But, you talked about my career coming to an abrupt halt. I never saw my role as a member of Parliament as a career. And I used to always make that point very volubly when I was campaigning for greater democracy inside the Labour Party. And that was one of the reasons why I think I was public enemy number one as far as the parliamentary Labour Party were concerned. Because I said, when you start treating your role as a member of Parliament as a career or a job, you start making decisions based upon your career, what's going to be good for your career. And that's why so many of them, well, all of them, in fact, not necessarily so many, all of them were unwilling to call out the Zionist lobby, because the Zionist lobby in Britain is very powerful. The Labour Friends of Israel, a sort of pressure group within the Parliamentary Labour Party. When I was a Member of Parliament from 2010 to 15, around half the members of the PLP, Parliamentary Labour Party, were in Labour Friends of Israel. And so it is a very, very powerful lobby inside the Parliamentary Labour Party and in the country as a whole. And people were simply unwilling to speak out against that. But look, the Labour Party was established, 124 years ago now, to try and be a voice for the working class in Britain. Up until that point in time, there'd always been a political duopoly in the country. It was the Liberals and the Conservatives, and the Liberals were seen as the kind of progressive force in Britain at that time. But in reality, they were really just another puppet of the establishment. And basically, this is what the Labour Party is today, and maybe it has always been so. But the Labour Party was founded, as I say, in 1900 to be that voice. 24 years later, it formed the first Labour government. It was a minority government, and the first Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Snowden, talked about at that time the wild men of the left. Bear in mind, this was only a few years after the Russian Revolution, and talked about the wild men of the left inside the Labour Party who wanted the Labour government at the time to put through full-throated socialist policies. But his main concern was to say we weren't going to do that, because what he wanted to do was to demonstrate to the establishment of the day that the Labour government was a safe pair of hands, that status quo would prevail under a Labour government. And then you fast forward to 1945, the government, which is held up, and indeed I used to always hold it up, and it did do many great things. It set in train a post-war consensus that lasted for 34 years, actually slightly less than that, actually. But if we get time, I'll talk about why I say it's slightly less than that. But, it created the welfare state, the National Health Service, built, a million homes for working class families and so on. So it did do some great things, but it could have gone a lot further. But it was still very much an imperialist government. And then you go forward a bit further to the 1960s, and we saw the introduction of comprehensive education and so on, and the Race Relations Act, etc., and so on. Equal pay was another thing that was brought in for men and women by the Labour government. But in the end, it was really, I think, crumbs from the table, because we could have gone a lot further. And that post-war consensus that was set in train for 34 years, all of those advances that were made for the working class have all been stripped away. And we're now in a situation where corporations hold even greater sway over the political sphere than they've ever done, and we've got a situation now where we are the sixth biggest economy in the world. There is really no excuse for anybody to be living in poverty in this country. I mean, when Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party, a lot of us were very excited. It became the biggest party in Western Europe. And when I got re-elected, because I lost my seat in 2015, I was arguing, as a member of the Socialist Campaign Group, that we needed to go further than what we were suggesting in the 2017 manifesto, because, it wasn't going far enough, in my opinion, and we could have been. I mean, what Jeremy was talking about was saying, look, we, in the lifetime of a parliament, we'll eradicate street homelessness, which is a great and laudable aim, but my God, we should have been going considerably further than that. And what we should have been saying is, by the end of a Labour government in office, a 4 or 5 year parliamentary term, we will eradicate poverty in this country. Now, that's not just a pipe dream. That is something that is doable. We are a very, as I've said, big and powerful economy. We issue our own currency. Britain can never run out of money. And this is where, I talk about that post-war consensus and lasting for 34 years until 1979. But in reality, it was 1976 where things started to go wrong, because Labour came into office in 1974
went to the IMF
well, yes, but before we went to the International Monetary Fund, Labour came in 1974 with a commitment to bring about an irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power in favour of working people and their family. They had an alternative economic strategy which they were implementing that was changing Britain, the face of Britain. And then Dennis Healey, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, decided that somehow Britain was running out of money. Impossible. We'd been off the Bretton Woods Agreement, which actually linked the pound sterling to the dollar, and the dollar was then linked to gold. Nixon jettisoned the Bretton Woods agreement. So it'd been a floating fiat currency ever since that time. So no way we could have run out of money. So he then went to the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund then insisted on austerity measures that must be imposed, which he duly did. That led directly to what was been referred to as the so-called winter of discontent. But all those austerity measures were unnecessary. Thatcher then came in and obviously turbocharged the neoliberal monetarist agenda. But it wasn't Thatcher that started it. It was Dennis Healey and Jim Callaghan. So, the Labour Party has always been a slave, it seems to me, to the bankers, to the corporate sector, to the establishment. And in many ways, I think that 1945 Labour government was maybe fearful. And the reason why, those reforms are put through was there was a fear in the mind of the establishment that after the Second World War, there was a real danger, in their view, of a revolution. And the chances of a successful revolution were very, very high then. Because my parents' generation, my dad, who'd served through that entire war, were being demobilized, and they'd been used to military discipline. They all knew how to use weapons. And so a revolution in those circumstances, had a very, very strong chance of success. And so there had to be some palliatives, it seems to me, and that's what was handed out. Things have gone considerably worse, of course. Well, I wouldn't say they were bad then, but I mean, a lot of bad things in terms of particularly foreign policy. We could have gone further in terms of domestic policy, but in general, things were moving in the right direction. I often give a little anecdote about when I was a young 19-year-old apprentice bricklayer. I was able to buy my own house, a brand new 3-bedroom semi-detached in a desirable village, which was 3 times what I earned as an apprentice bricklayer. That was the narrowest of the inequality in Britain had become. Because every year from that period until Healey went to the International Monetary Fund, inequality narrowed year on year. And more of the nation's wealth was going into the pockets of ordinary working class people. And we knew as young people leaving school that we were destined to have a better standard of living than our parents did. But Labour parties jettisoned all that. When Blair came to power in 1997, he said his job was to build on Thatcher's achievements, not to tear them down. She didn't make any achievements. I mean, there was achievements in terms of in favour of the ruling class, the corporate class, but not in terms of the working class.
In fact, at one point, it was said that Margaret Thatcher's greatest achievement was Tony Blair.
She said that
as the leader of the Labour Party.
Her greatest achievement, when she was asked, was Tony Blair and New Labour, because we made our enemies, change their view, change their policy agenda in that sense. So, so that's where we are. And so now we're in a terrible place. I mean, we had this hope when Corbyn was elected as leader of the Labour Party, but he was far too timid in the end. The entirety of the so-called socialist campaign group, and I say so-called socialist campaign group because they ain't socialists. They don't know the meaning of the word solidarity. And even though John McDonnell, who was a shadow chancellor at the time, used to he may still do this, end all of his speeches by saying solidarity. But when it came to the crunch, he wasn't prepared to show any solidarity, and nor were any members of the socialist campaign group either. And I'm not saying to blow my own trumpet or say I'm anything special, because I'm not. I'm just a working class geezer from Derby, but I was the only one that was prepared to speak out against the Zionist lobby, to speak out for things, like in terms of you mentioned about Venezuela and so on. These things are kind of just, common sense to me, but to speak up for people who are being traduced and thrown under the bus. People like Ken Livingstone was being demonised as an anti-Semite. Ken Livingstone, when he was leader of the Greater London Council in the 80s, and when he went on to become the Mayor of London, but particularly when he was the leader of the Greater London Council in the 1980s, before you were born, I think. But he earned the sobriquet as a loony lefty partly for his stance on fighting racism. And I believe that Ken Livingstone did more in public office than anybody to advance the cause of anti-racism. He was thrown out of the party, demonised as a bigot, and so many other people were as well. And I was the only MP, which shocked me to the core. I've got to say that. I was the only MP that was prepared to speak up for Ken, to speak up for people like Jackie Walker and Tony Greenstein and Cyril Chilson, whose parents survived Auschwitz, who were all being demonised as anti-Semites. And it was clear that anti-Semitism was being weaponised in order to destroy the Corbyn project, to destroy the prospect of a socialist anti-imperialist government coming to power. But Jeremy lost the plot because he listened to idiots around him who said that he had to try and placate the Zionist lobby. And I kept saying to Jeremy, look, Jeremy, stop saying sorry. Every apology you make, every concession you give to the Zionist lobby is just feeding the beast and making it stronger. And ultimately, they're going to come for you and they're going to smash this project. You didn't need to be a kind of political expert, some sort of political soothsayer to be able to see that. It was plain common sense, plain as a pikestaff. Why was I the only person speaking up for, people, activists, grassroots activists and Labour movement icons like Ken Livingstone? Why was the only MP as well speaking out at the time for Julian Assange? It just didn't compute to me. And that's why I think, the scales have, as it were, fallen from my eyes with regard to the Labour Party. It's lost now. I mean, our duty is try to destroy the Labour Party and build something new, as difficult as that might be. But your description of the Democrats is a carbon copy of where we're at in Britain today. Yeah. That is the Labour Party. They represent the interests of the corporate class, the war machine, and Israel. That's it. No more, no less.
And I don't think there's a coincidence that both Kamala Harris and Keir Starmer, but also Biden in his political career, have a history with locking people up, literally putting people in jail. And in a way, what Starmer as Prime Minister does is it wears away where the political sphere begins and the security state ends. And there's no political checks on that system because he's served it so loyally and he'll be willing to do more. But, Chris, there's a couple of reasons that I think you would have been scalped, aside from also the wider campaign to subjugate the Corbyn movement, which include, for example, your Democracy Roadshow, but also your work on the Institute for Statecraft. Yeah. Now, Ammar, you were working with Chris at the time when he was doing these two things, right? Could you tell me a bit about them, both of you? Ammar's perspective at the time would also be important. But, Chris, what was your what was the bee in your bonnet with the Institute for Statecraft? And, when I look at the campaign against all of us, which was the campaign against Corbynism, the killing of Corbynism, it definitely was a shared project. And I think it unleashed new levels of integration and coordination between the Israelis and the British in this country. Because a lot of the Zionist lobby groups that were campaigning against all of us are funded by the British government. Yep. But yet are in a constant loop of communication with the Israeli embassy. And so that kind of puts us in an interesting new place where Britain becomes a playground of foreign interference, but the British security services are directly participating in it or involved in it. So now the Institute for Statecraft is an interesting case to look at, because you went extremely hard on that. And it's without a doubt, there would have been buttons pushed following that.
I think so. I mean, to me, it was an abuse of power.
What was it? What was the Institute for Statecraft?
Well, Institute of Statecraft was a charity, actually, and it was supposedly about countering Russian disinformation. But what first came to my attention after some documents were leaked about the reality of what it was up to, and one of the things it was doing, of course, was attacking Jeremy Corbyn and senior figures inside the Labour Party. And so that's what kind of whetted my appetite. I think, well, what's this all about? So I started asking questions and using my parliamentary platform to ask formal written parliamentary questions of Alan Duncan, who was the Foreign Office Minister at the time.
Who was it staffed by, the Institute for Statecraft? These were figures from British military intelligence. That's right,
former
these were
British
figures from
military
MI5,
characters. Exactly.
MI6.
Exactly, yeah. And they had clusters which they would activate at any given moment in academia, in the media, etc.
Some of the biggest journalists in this country.
Yes,
were part
indeed,
of
they absolutely were. For sure, they were. David Aronovich, Cadwallader, another one. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the list is quite extensive, actually.
So they were directly coordinating.
Absolutely,
with,
yeah. Yes, but interesting as well, receiving millions of pounds in public money.
Yes,
that's just where I was challenging the government to give.
Well, you
money.
doorstepped them.
Well, I did actually. Yeah,
it's something that never happens.
No,
never happens. In for instance, Mnar in the US, it may be slightly different, but here, a very common tactic of the mainstream media is to doorstep targets. They go to their house, they knock on their door, and they say, "Hey, we've got this ridiculous story about you. Please give us a response."
So I've come here today to see if I can get answers directly from the organisation itself. Is he down? Are you down? Right. Yeah, I'm Chris Williamson. I'm the Member of Parliament for Derby North. I'd like to ask some questions about why is it that you've been smearing Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party and interfering in the internal affairs of fellow European democracies? Want to ask some questions about Pedro Baños? Hello?
You took it upon yourself to go to their offices, or at least one of their offices, because we know there's another one in Scotland.
Well, we call it an office. It's actually a derelict or semi-derelict mill, actually. And
which you went to also.
I went to also, yeah, just to sort of prove, or see what it was, and we drove down this. I was on the Democracy Roadshow, as it happens, and I was speaking in Dundee, and it's not far from Dundee. And so I thought, well, will you take the opportunity to have a look at this? My partner was with me. She was actually quite frightened and nervous going down this dark. She said, "Oh my God, what are we doing?" I think she thought we was going to get hooded and extraordinarily rendered somewhere. Yeah, exactly. So, and then I got out of the car and she was like, "No, don't get out, don't get out." I said, "No." I said, "You've got to get out as well because I want you to take a photograph."
But you don't have MPs doing stuff like that.
No, look, and I was very fortunate to have people like Ammar and the team who's absolutely fantastic and a great videographer and really great sort of support in terms of research and pointing me in the right direction.
Great beard too.
Beg pardon?
Great beard too.
Great beard too. Yeah. So that was great to have that, and look, I felt it was the right thing to do. The whole thing about the Democracy Roadshow. We were going all over the country. We were getting big. We were really inspiring people, if I say so myself. People really thought we were on a journey to really transform the country. People really believed in Jeremy. Thought this is going to happen. I mean, I was making the point, look, this democracy that we're talking about, this internal democracy in the Labour Party, this isn't a navel contemplating exercise. We need to democratise the party, as Tony Benn used to say, in order to democratise the country. And the other point I was making to them is that, look, there are incredibly powerful forces ranged against us. Just remember, I was telling them, that shortly after Jeremy Corbyn was elected as the leader of the party, a serving army general said that he would they would use
mutiny.
Fair means or foul. Fair means or foul. This is what they said. To stop Corbyn, cutting defence spending, or leaving NATO or scrapping Trident. Now that is treason.
Yeah.
Actually, he was threatening treason. This was reported as if it's perfectly normal.
And that's the whole basis of Chris Donnelly, one of the key minds behind the Institute of Statecraft and a network of other organisations. His thing was about trying to return the allocation of funds by the government to a war footing.
Exactly, and they wanted to change the sort of the mindset of the wider general public away from this kind of airy-fairy kind of welfare, which I mean, the welfare system in this country is about the most parsimonious in Western Europe. But the point I was making is, look, we will potentially need a movement on the streets to defend a Labour government, because it's not beyond the realms of possibility that there could be a coup. Let's remember, of course, there was a planned coup, which never came off in the end, against Harold Wilson. I mean,
and there was the Genevieve letter.
Oh, well, that
Ramsay
goes back
MacDonald.
still further. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And even when you look at the Labour Party as a political operation, its servility to war of the time. The founder of the Labour Party, Keir Hardie, when he died, because he'd gone against received wisdom on World War One. The industrial scale killing, 20 million people died in World War One. He was lambasted in the press as Kerr von Hardy. They called him a German agent. But his death was unremarked upon in Parliament, even by the Labour Party when it happened, because of that.
No, exactly.
So what does that tell us about this?
Well, it's a tool of it tells us that it's a tool of the establishment.
And let's not forget, Harold Wilson was somebody who did the bidding of the US in Diego Garcia. He gave Diego Garcia to the US military. Harold Wilson was someone who did help them, despite not sending the military officially. He helped the US in Vietnam. It was Harold Wilson that sold over 500 Centurion tanks to the Israelis to carry out the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza with. So he was somebody who the Americans had this sort of irrational mistrust of. And of course, that was revealed by Colin Wallace, Operation Clockwork Orange, which was literally MI5 briefing people on dirt about the current Prime Minister. That was Harold Wilson.
Yes, exactly.
And this was the very British
So
coup.
we knew what we were going to be potentially up against. Were Jeremy, to go through the doors. But the final thing I'll just say, just in relation to the whole kind of democracy thing, the point I was making to Jeremy and the Socialist Campaign Group is that the result that Labour achieved in 2017, which saw the biggest increase in vote share the Labour Party had ever achieved since 1945, although didn't obviously get over the line. But had we got over the line, that would not have worked, because they would have outed Jeremy, or they'd have certainly sabotaged the programme. So I was saying to Jeremy, look, that is the best result we could have got. Massive increase. It shows that there's a real appetite for what we are talking about. What we now need to do is ensure that we get the democracy reforms through, because if we don't do that, then, you're just going to be held hostage. Now, when Jeremy in September 2018 made two fatal errors, he agreed to the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism because he lost a vote in the National Executive Committee. What, in my opinion, Jeremy should have done is to come out of that National Executive Committee and say, OK, I've lost the vote here, but I'm going to take this onto the floor of the Labour Party conference later this month, and I believe that I will prevail because the National Executive Committee is wrong. And they were, clearly, of course they were wrong. I mean, that was then used as a stick to attack even more Labour activists. And the other fatal error he made was to ask Len McCluskey to vote down the democracy reforms, which were, to say overwhelming. There was over 90% of the CLPs, constituency Labour parties at conference, wanted these democracy reforms to go through. And the way in which the votes are divided in the Labour Party conference is that 50% goes to the constituency Labour parties and 50% to the trade unions. There's actually the figures slightly different to that, because there are some affiliated socialist societies who get 2 or 3% of that. But essentially, it's 50-50. Had Len McCluskey Unite delegation, who actually had passed a resolution at their own conference in 2016 in favour of mandatory open selections for MPs, that would have sailed through with about a 10 or 15% majority. And the Parliamentary Labour Party, were on the ropes. They really, they were punch drunk. They really thought their days, some of them, were numbered, and they also knew that if they managed to survive a reselection process, that they would have the sword of Damocles hanging over their head. They knew that they would have to then respect the will of the members, who were much more in touch with the wider general public on policy than they were, because the Corbyn programme was overwhelmingly popular. If you broke down each individual policy agenda, massive support for it. So that's where we are. But so it's a tragedy, a total tragedy, that this was all squandered. Yeah. And we are where we are now with a Sir Keir Starmer government in office that is totally in the pockets, as I've already said, of the corporate sector, the Zionist lobby, the Israeli regime, and the military-industrial complex.
So, Ammar, what was the view from the inside of all of this? Because the campaign against Chris, which we haven't touched on too much, was it seemed more aggressive than some others, and I think it's because Chris was a high-ranking scalp really at that point, and making sure that he was well and truly buried was a strategic objective of the lobby at that point. So what was the view from the inside?
Well, we have to go back a bit further than 2019, February 2019, which is when Chris was suspended. Back really to the first leadership campaign in 2015 when Jeremy Corbyn was standing to be leader of the Labour Party alongside three others. And it was during the election campaign to be leader of the party that Corbyn made his disposition known, which is that while as a backbencher, he seemingly had very strong views on NATO and anti-war and on Zionism even. And, you know, he obviously famously talks about Hamas and Hezbollah, his friends in Hamas and Hezbollah. His first interview at a time in Britain when actually supporting Hamas and Hezbollah was not against the law. Now it's against the law. You can't say that because the political wings of those organizations are now prescribed. He completely rode back on everything. And it demonstrated that whenever he was in a period of conflict, his disposition was to retreat, was to apologize, was to actually become very flustered and not have the confidence of his convictions in any way, shape, or form, despite having been on the backbenches for over 3 decades, had a significant amount of political experience before then. He had no confidence in his convictions. And so when the first sort of operation began, because there were anti-Semitism smears that began before that, but when it really sort of kicked off was in February 2016.
I mean, I think Galloway and Bradford was the test run. If you look at some of the characters, Ben Judah, for example, alleging that he was attacked for being Jewish at a George Galloway event in Bradford. You know, Galloway as a titan of British politics has been a playground of experimentation for psychological operations to try and subvert him. And I believe that while there may have been some others, I believe Galloway and Bradford, where this is an Israel-free zone, this was a test run for a lot of the anti-Semitism stuff that then played out on the Corbyn front.
Definitely. I mean, I think there's obviously lots of antecedents to this, but if we're talking strictly within the Corbyn era, the way it sort of played out in terms of the strategy they used to derail Corbyn, they sort of began to take root in February 2016 with this Oxford University Labour Club scandal, how there's apparently anti-Semitism there. Then Corbyn, his disposition was not to investigate himself and see, were these allegations verifiable? Of course they weren't. His instinct was to instruct someone who I would call a Zionist, Baroness Janet Royale, to conduct an investigation into what had happened there. And then he did it again with the Chakrabarti inquiry. He got someone else to investigate, do we have a problem with anti-Semitism? And of course, as Chris was saying, I mean, he threw his longtime comrade, Ken Livingstone, the former mayor of London, twice under the bus. He essentially kept throwing his own allies under the bus, and that continued. But these people generally were lower level. I mean, Ken Livingstone, of course, was mayor of London. By that time, he was sort of a retiree. He was just sitting on the National Executive Committee. He wasn't sort of a senior politician. When Chris came in, it was quite clear that, Chris, he's a member of Parliament, so the sort of boundary hadn't really been crossed in terms of really going after a member of Parliament at that period of time. He was, an ally of Corbyn. So his proximity was known. He was in a very strong position, and he was in the ascendancy because there was at least the perception among Labour MPs that there was a huge amount of support for Jeremy Corbyn from the membership, and if they transgressed the line too far, there was a perception that they would lose their seats, and so there was this threat hanging over them that they couldn't actually really go after Jeremy Corbyn himself too personally, or the people who were sort of within his immediate proximity. But when that threat was essentially jettisoned after the 2018 Labour Party conference at which I spoke, because we were promoting the Democracy Roadshow and promoting the Democracy Review that happened in the party, once that was jettisoned by Unite, the main trade union supporting Jeremy Corbyn, by Jeremy Corbyn himself, by all of his allies, and the threat to those MPs was removed, it then gave them extra license, then start engaging in this, what was basically a proxy war against Jeremy Corbyn, attacking all the supporters and allies who were closest to him. And so that's when they were able to really go after Chris. I mean, it was essentially something that they'd wanted to do for a very long time, I think. I mean, they'd been railing against him for a very long time, and there were smears and articles and some particular lobby journalists who really had Chris in their scopes. But they essentially managed to grind down the leadership of the party to such an extent that they then had the license to go after Chris, and also the membership, because whilst a lot of them were quite militant and were willing to really, fight to protect Jeremy, to go against
signal from the leadership.
Well, they were completely demobilized. So whilst we had this membership of like 500,000 people, they were just rendered useless. I mean, as an ordinary lay member of the party, there was actually nothing I could really do to leverage power in the party at that point.
Yeah.
So he demobilized his own people.
How similar, Mnar, does this sound to the US situation? We see within even a kind of weird formation like the Squad, you had Ilhan Omar, who's a bit better when it comes to Palestine. AOC has been doing some really humiliating, groveling type of maneuvers with the Israel lobby. You, of course, saw recently a Columbia professor basically threatened to assassinate Cory Bush of the Democrat Party. You also had the example of Jamal Bowman, who, again, despite him making all of these acquiescing essentially to Israel lobby stuff, AIPAC still pumped so much money into his opponent. And it's interesting how similar kind of strategies and tactics are used across the board. Do you have anything to add to that in terms of the US context?
I mean, it sounds exactly like how it works in the United States, except AIPAC is not even registered as a foreign agent in the United States, and yet they're pumping, millions of dollars into political candidates to promote apartheid, to push for militarism, war with Iran, and support for Israel's genocide in Gaza. And if you dare to speak up, like somebody like Ilhan Omar, who even brought attention to the fact that Israel lobbying money is affecting policy, she was attacked and targeted, and she was accused of anti-Semitism just for simply tweeting, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby."
Yeah.
It is all about the Benjamins, baby. I think most Americans would agree, who are aware enough, that we don't have a democracy anymore in the United States. Study after study, I think it was from Harvard, shows that we have an oligarchy, and our elected officials represent the interests of not the people. They represent the interests of a very few 1% elite billionaire class, and a lot of them are Zionist. And so Israel lobbying money from the the Jewish National Fund, for example. All of this money goes towards these elected officials to push these pro-war policies. And in this election season, we saw AIPAC spend a record number of money on Cory Bush and Joe Bowman's opponents. Excuse me. Yeah, their opponents. A record number of money.
And these were mild critics.
They're not the most critical. And like you said with Joe Bowman, he apologized many times for Israel. And yet he was still targeted, which goes to show like you should not bend over backwards for Israel in any way, shape, or form, because they're just going to use that against you, and they're still going to target you.
Yeah.
And that's what they've done. And I just want to mention, something that you mentioned, Chris, with the Israel lobby in the UK. We have also the Anti-Defamation League, which, in my opinion, based on our research and MITpress, it appears that the Anti-Defamation League, which is an Israel lobby group, basically, act as a spy agency for the state of Israel. Historically, the FBI wanted them to register as a foreign agent because it was very clear that they were spying on American citizens. They were spying on anti-apartheid activists, even Greenpeace activists, and very notable figures like Desmond Tutu. And they were taking that intelligence, that information, and sharing it with Israel's Mossad. and the Israeli government. And now what we see is that the Anti-Defamation League is working with police departments and working with the FBI now to spy on Americans. And so, the tentacles of this Israeli lobby machines, they spread far and wide. And and they're not even registered as foreign agents. And we know that Israel tried to find many loopholes and not having to register as a foreign agent. But we have the same problem in America, which is our political system is working in the interest of a foreign entity, which is the Israeli government, which is acting in apartheid. And we have these think tanks that are funded by these weapons manufacturers, and in a lot of cases funded directly by the state of Israel and big money donors. And they're the ones who are writing the policies for our elected officials. And so when we have people like Kamala Harris coming up to the forefront, or Joe Biden or whatever, and all, whether it's Trump or Kamala Harris, they're not even writing their own speeches at this point. They're written by the Israel lobby. I mean, look at 2018. AIPAC wrote Obama's AIPAC speech in 2018.
I mean, interestingly, one of the individuals who has been credited as writing Biden's script on Israel, Haim Saban, has led a campaign to ban Bisan Ouda, the Palestinian journalist in Gaza, from the Emmy Awards because she was nominated for an Emmy Award. And their group, the Creative Community for Peace, which is a proxy of Stand With Us, the well-known Israel lobby organization funded by the Israeli Prime Minister's office, Haim Saban has led that campaign and that letter. But who is Haim Saban? He's simultaneously a director of Universal Music Group. He's one of the biggest funders of the Friends of the IDF historically. But I guess, Ammar, what I wanted to ask you about then, are we getting into a tail wagging the dog territory here? Because while we have established that, look, there's a trilateral security state that operates in the Middle East as one hand, it seemingly now operates at home as one hand. We historically know that Israel will outsource things to Britain, like the training of the Palestinian Authority. Britain will outsource things to Israel, like the hacking of the phones of British citizens. Yeah. But, there's a certain perspective that would be critical of what we're saying. They'd say, oh, well, you need to understand Israel as a bulwark of US imperialism in the region. You need to understand that Britain, through the Balfour Declaration, is responsible for even the existence of Israel. Are you not getting ahead of yourselves here, guys? Are you not blowing Israel's influence out of proportion? They like to point, and of course, David Miller has excellent work on this, really pointing out the majesty of the Zionist lobby in the US. But they'd say, oh, you look at AIPAC's contributions and you compare it to fossil fuels, it's dwarfed by the money that comes from big oil and big gas. But in actuality, as David's research shows, the Zionist lobby and the operations of it in the US are far beyond just an organization like AIPAC. Of course, they also involve the ADL, massive organization, but there's many, many other parts of it. So what would be your response, Ammar, if we were to say you're getting ahead of yourselves here, guys?
Well, I think there has to be a reevaluation, because I think you can certainly say when the Zionist entity was first founded that, yes, it was sort of a proxy of the United States of America, of Britain, and that essentially answered to them because it owed its existence to them directly at that point. But what's happened over the past decades, and I'd say probably happened earlier in the United States, but certainly I think you could say within Britain, it's really happened within the last sort of 10 years. There's been this campaign of state capture, where you've had these lobby groups, and the United States, very famous, we know about AIPAC, we know about the ADL, and they have disciplined elected officials to the extent that it can't be said that they prioritize purely US interests over that of the state of Israel. They clearly don't. They know that if they criticize the Zionist regime. They're going to have, and this is obviously because of the influence of money in politics in the US, they're going to have their opponents in primaries being funded by Zionist lobby groups. So that then disincentivizes them when it comes to looking at things in the House of Representatives or the Senate to, not give money to Israel. And I think that influence has existed in Britain for a long time, because say even several decades, but I think it really picked up pace under Jeremy Corbyn. I think Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party was the incubator for Israel lobby tactics to expand and increase in Britain, where they were sort of battle tested before they were then exported into universities, where we had people like David Miller being, sacked from Bristol University.
With direct state intervention.
With direct state intervention, of course, exactly.
Which again, this is key to it, because we have to understand them as working in concert, if not the same hand, happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Same with Chris. There was a letter. The same way there was a letter with David. Yeah. There was a letter which was signed by cross-party figures within the House of Lords and the House of Parliament, calling for you to be ousted. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the letter was signed, I think it was the Labour parliamentarians. There were certainly Tories calling for me to be removed, for me to be suspended. James Cleverly, I think, on the day I was suspended, called for my suspension at Prime Minister's questions. I was actually in a meeting with Jeremy's team before PMQs that day. I'd been called in. A very aggressive phone call from somebody who worked in his office of parliamentary liaison staffer. And you say, you're leading every effing news broadcast, you need to come in, sort of thing. So anyway, I went and we had a conversation. As a favour to Jeremy, I stupidly agreed to issue a qualified apology. That was then weaponised against me, though.
Yeah,
they said that
this proves our point.
Exactly, proved our point. It's a mealy-mouthed apology. He knows he's done something wrong, but this is not good enough.
They
you
smell
need to go
blood.
further.
They smell blood.
They had blood in the water, and absolutely they circled like sharks. And it wasn't just parliamentarians though that signed it, and it wasn't just obviously the opposition who were calling for me to be removed. They also arranged for, I think it was 100 or 200 staff members to say that they didn't feel safe going to work.
These are staff members of the Labour Party.
Yes, and Labour MPs, and I believe staff working in the head office as well. Certainly, Labour MPs staffers were signed this letter, saying they wouldn't feel safe if I was still a member of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Wouldn't feel safe going to work. As if I was. What was I going to do?
I mean, with your case, Chris, I think they really pulled out all the stops, because it wasn't just parliamentarians and staff members in Parliament. They leveraged, I think, probably every prominent Israel lobby group in Britain, including the Board of Deputies of British Jews, the Jewish Leadership Council. Exact same thing, because I remember watching that unfold on that day, which was the 27th of February, if I'm not mistaken, in 2019. And I had the exact same parallels with David Miller, because I was following that case as well when it happened, when it was unfolding. In fact, they were actually much more aggressive with David. Then they started leveraging individual parliamentarians to make speeches in Parliament and various news
literally
articles.
Jenrick, who was a minister in the government, called on Bristol to sack him.
Yes.
I mean, it's extraordinary. They're direct state intervention.
So this is when we go back to this idea of the tail now wagging the dog. They've now managed to get to a position where any form of dissent is now considered totally legitimate. And if you voice that dissent, you'll not only just be reprimanded, you'll lose your job.
Yeah.
And they won't stop there. They won't just stop when you've lost your job. They'll then try to ostracize you from public life. Make what you're saying illegitimate to be heard in any sort of platform. Demonetize you. They'll keep going.
It's all happened.
Keep going. It's totalitarian.
The demonetization, I think, is one of the worst ones, because we at Mint Press have experienced demonetization.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
It's like a form of sanctions, the same kind of sanctions that countries like Venezuela or Iran or Cuba, 25% of the population is experiencing. They're now taking this policy of sanctions against enemies of the state to now their own citizens. It's happening in the United States as well. To journalists as well, and people like David Miller. There's a lot of academics in the U.S. that have been ostracized in the same way and fired and let go because they dared to speak up against the Israeli war machine.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I think in Britain in particular, the level of sort of totalitarianism has increased. I think that's what's new, because even at the beginning in sort of 2015, you could be an MP, and there were various MPs sort of in the parliament before Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the party, who did sort of regularly, from the backbenchers, they would stand up, they would criticize Israel, they would say things that would now be sort of considered anti-Semitic, wouldn't be allowed at all within the corridors of power. But they would say those things, and they'd be just considered to be potentially eccentric by the sort of liberal mainstream class. They might be ignored or shunned. Now it's a case of not just ignoring or shunning people, it's trying to completely obliterate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Jeremy sent shockwaves through the establishment. The fact that somebody who, I know in the end, he buckled, but that potential of somebody who was perceived as a real anti-imperialist, somebody who was very strongly pro-Palestine, anti-war, etc., got within a hair's breadth of becoming the prime minister, and that was
Petrified
obviously
them.
unconscionable. So that's why I think they're going so much further. But I mean, just thinking back to kind of the build-up to my suspension, I remember being invited by they have the Book of Commitment commemorating Holocaust. Commemoration of the Holocaust Memorial Day, and I'd asked by the Holocaust Education Trust. I'd been asked, "Will I please go and sign this?" And which I did, and I've done that every year. And I think for a very considered and good message about solidarity and standing together to fight hate, to stop this ever happening again. Words to that effect. It was a nice message. That was then weaponized against me. That was then, how dare you? You're spitting on the memory of the people that perished in the Holocaust. And I got an open letter from the so-called Jewish Leadership Council, saying, what a disgrace it was that I'd had the temerity to sign this letter. The Holocaust Education Trust had asked me to sign it, then actually took a photograph of me and asked me to put it on social media, then attacked me remorselessly for having the temerity to. Well, maybe I don't know, but possibly it was.
A button was pushed.
This is all psychological warfare.
Yeah, for
I mean,
sure.
every form of these attacks is psychological warfare to beat you down.
Yes.
To make you feel like you have, there's nothing that you can do to
absolutely.
Ostracize you, no money left, and make you lose.
And the cancel
that
culture that you spoke about, demonetizing and all that. I mean, that is sort of still happening. I mean, it's very difficult for me to get a platform on any sort of mainstream. I never get invited, very rarely anyway now. Not particularly necessarily looking for it, but interesting. There's not a university in the country where I can actually speak now. I'm actually and I was due, would you believe, to speak at the Oxford Union about veganism. I've been a vegan since 1976. I was cancelled from that.
Yeah.
But, never mind about you can't not speak about, Israel, Palestine. Can't talk about anything.
They want to make the prize.
You cannot have a platform.
Yeah.
You are a non-person.
That's cancel culture.
Yes, absolutely.
In the United States, it's being led by the Democratic Party.
Yeah, absolutely. And here by the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And still we rise.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the end of another episode of the Watchdog on Mint Press. Thank you so much to my guest, Chris Williamson, Ammar Kazmi, and my co-host, Mnar Adley. And thank you very much to the viewers for watching us this week on the Watchdog. See you again next time.